James Edward Smith was convicted of a heinous crime that landed him on death row in 1983. Ended up murdering a co-worker, Larry Don Rojas, during the heist.
James Edward Smith was a tarot card reader and voodoo priest who was convicted of the robbery homicide of Houston office insurance manager Larry Rojas in 1983.
This is the guy that is on all of the lists of like weird last meals. I was like, who is this? What is his deal? His name is James Edward Smith.
The story begins in Houston, 1983. James Edward Smith entered the Union Life Insurance Company with a gun and a plan to rob the place. But things went wrong fast. When employee Larry Rojas tried to protect his co-worker, Smith shot him point blank. Even though Rojas had already handed over the cash, Smith fired again, this time fatally. What makes this chilling isn't just the murder. It's that Smith, a former tarot reader and self-identified voodoo priest, believed the act was part of something much bigger, a path toward spiritual evolution.
He could have just taken the money and gone, but he turns around, shoots Larry in the chest, and when Larry dropped to the floor, he shoots him again.
Once behind bars, James's behavior oscillated between violent and eerily composed. He tried escaping during jury selection. He threatened guards, and he clung tightly to beliefs in reincarnation. To him, death wasn't punishment, it was transformation. While his mother fought tirelessly to delay his execution, James rejected every appeal. To him, this wasn't justice, it was destiny. He repeatedly claimed he was innocent, but he didn't want to spend his life on death row. Instead of fighting it, he was like, just kill me already. As the final date loomed, Smith warned prison guards that his ghost would haunt Huntsville for 300 years if denied the ritual he believed necessary for spiritual transition. This wasn't just about a meal, it was about the soul. On June 26, 1990, James Edward Smith was led to the execution chamber. His last meal request, not food, but racunda dirt, a sacred element in voodoo rituals meant to guide his spirit into reincarnation. Officials denied it. It wasn't food, it wasn't sanitary. Instead, they gave him a cup of plain yogurt. Smith's last words, "I myself did not kill anyone, but I go to my death without begging for my life. I will not humiliate myself. I will let no man break me." He smiled, winked, and said, "Hare Krishna." The victim's widow, Deborah Rico, later said, "He gave up his right to live when he pulled the trigger. My son was 1 year old. He robbed him of a chance to ever know his dad."
I myself did not kill anyone, but I go to my death without begging for my life. I will not humiliate myself. I will let no man break me. He then smiled, winked, and said, "Hare Krishna."
Public reaction to Smith's execution was mixed. Some saw a mentally ill man failed by the system. Others, a calculated killer hiding behind mysticism. The haunting irony? He warned them, without the dirt, his soul wouldn't rest. Now, some say his ghost still lingers over Huntsville, just as he promised. Before he died, he warned prison officials that his ghost would haunt over Huntsville for another 300 years. A prison official later recalled Smith's expression as the drugs entered his system. Calm, composed, almost as if he was stepping through a door he had long been waiting to open. They say you can tell when someone's at peace. James Edward Smith, in his own way, might have been.
Providing a glimpse into the mind of a man facing his final moments.
A lump of dirt, a story of belief, madness, and mortality. James Edward Smith's life challenges how we view death, justice, and redemption. Was he a madman, a mystic, or both? In the end, his final request wasn't about what he wanted to eat. It was about what he wanted to become. Every Halloween, parents whisper warnings about poisoned candy, but for one Texas town in 1974, that fear became horrifyingly real. A trusted father slipped cyanide-laced pixie sticks into children's candy bags. One child died, and the man behind it became known as the Candyman Killer. This is the story of Ronald Clark O'Bryan, the man who killed Halloween.
Do you remember trick-or-treating as a kid and being warned that the candy might be poisoned? That there were needles in the candy or there were razor blades in the apples?
Called the Candyman, a Pasadena father of two who passed out poison candy to trick-or-treaters Halloween night, 1974.
Halloween night, October 31st, 1974. Ronald O'Bryan joined his neighbors for trick-or-treating with his two children. He returned with 5 pixie sticks, one for each child. Hours later, his 8-year-old son Timothy was dead from cyanide poisoning. What appeared to be a horrifying accident quickly unraveled. Investigators learned O'Bryan had recently taken out life insurance policies on his children totaling $60,000. His motive? A mountain of debt and a belief he could kill his son, collect the money, and no one would know. But someone always knows. And in this case, the truth was horrifying.
By this pixie stick. Immediately, Timothy complained about the weird, bitter taste of the candy, which Ronald helped him wash down with a glass of Kool-Aid. Within moments, Timothy experienced severe stomach cramps and violently vomited.
After his conviction in 1975, O'Bryan was sent to death row in Huntsville, Texas. He spent nearly a decade appealing his sentence, each time denied. Even among the condemned, he was despised. Inmates refused to speak to him. Guards avoided eye contact. He became a ghost within the walls of Ellis Unit, known only by one name, the Candyman. After 3 postponed execution dates, the state of Texas finally set Ronald O'Bryan's death for March 31st, 1984. With no more appeals, no more delays, he spent his final hours in complete silence, trapped between reality and consequence. That evening, O'Bryan ordered a T-bone steak, fries, sweet peas, corn, Boston cream pie, and sweet iced tea. At 11:59 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. His last words? He called his execution a mistake, but never once apologized for killing his own son. As the chemicals flowed, he went still. At 12:01 a.m., April 1st, 1984, the man who killed Halloween was declared dead. What is about to transpire is wrong. I forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Outside the prison, over 300 people gathered, some cheering, others protesting the death penalty. Many threw candy into the air, yelling, "Trick or treat." What O'Bryan left behind wasn't just pain, it was paranoia. For decades, parents inspected every piece of candy, and Halloween was never seen the same way again. Journalists described the moment as eerily quiet. The room, sterile. His breathing slowed. His body relaxed. There was no drama. Just the end of a man who silenced his own child for a payout. One witness wrote, "It was over before it ever began." Pentobarbital, inducing unconsciousness, followed by cessation of respiratory and cardiac function. Ronald Clark O'Bryan wanted financial freedom. What he got was infamy. His act of betrayal turned a night of joy into one of horror and created a legend parents still fear today. He didn't just kill his son. He killed trust, innocence, and Halloween. A Houston police officer gunned down during a routine traffic stop. A convicted felon with a violent past. And a legal saga that would span over 3 decades. This is the story of Carl Wayne Buntion, the oldest death row inmate in Texas history, and the execution that reopened wounds and sought closure.
Carl Wayne Buntion has been on death row for more than 3 decades, convicted of the murder of Houston police officer James Irby.
The family of Houston police officer James Irby finally gets justice more than 30 years after he was shot and killed in the line of duty.
It began on a June day in 1990. Officer James Irby, a husband and father of 2, pulled over a red Pontiac in North Houston. Inside, Carl Wayne Buntion, a man with a long criminal record and just weeks out on parole. As Irby spoke to the driver, Bunchen stepped out from the passenger side and shot Irby point blank in the head, then twice more in the back. He fled, firing at random civilians before being captured. The city was shaken and a community demanded justice.
Speaking with the driver, Bunchen slipped out of the passenger seat and shot him one time in the head. He then shot him twice more in the back.
Bunchen was convicted in 1991 and sentenced to death. But that wasn't the end. His sentence was overturned once on appeal and resentenced again in 2012. While incarcerated, he claimed remorse, saying he thought of Irby's death every day. In his final years, Bunchen's lawyers argued he was too old and frail to be a threat. He had kidney problems, couldn't walk unaided, and rarely left his cell. Still, the courts were unmoved.
But I'm too old. I've got a pinched nerve in my leg, and I can't go to the day room and walk around because I can't stand up that long. And I have to use to take a shower, I have to use, they've got a medical shower.
April 2022, a judge sets the date, April 21st. The Irby family, after 32 years, prepares for what they hoped would be a moment of justice. The execution would mark a historical moment, the end of the longest standing death row case in Texas. At 6:39 p.m. in Huntsville, Carl Wayne Bunchen was executed by lethal injection. He spoke for 4 minutes before dying, expressing remorse and saying he hoped to hug the Irby family in heaven. Officer Irby's widow, Mara, was there, along with her now grown children, and said, "I feel joy. I finally took the deepest breath in 32 years." For the first time in Texas, a spiritual advisor was permitted to touch and pray with the inmate during the procedure.
A full dose of pentobarbital was administered, and 13 minutes later, he was pronounced deceased at 6:39.
The execution reignited a long-standing debate. Protesters gathered outside the Huntsville unit, chanting against the death penalty. Others saw it as long overdue justice. District Attorney Kim Ogg called Bunchen a cold-blooded executioner, while victims' advocates cited how the case reshaped Texas laws, ending early releases for violent offenders and strengthening parole enforcement. For Gary Blankenship, Irby's longtime partner, witnessing the execution was personal. He carried Irby's body to the morgue that day in 1990. "I think pure evil has left this world," he said. For him and many officers present, the execution marked not vengeance, but closure and the fulfillment of a promise made 32 years ago.
I actually took him to the morgue, and I've gone through 32 years, 2 trials with the family.
Carl Wayne Bunchen's execution closed a chapter, but the ripple effects of his crime forever altered lives, policies, and hearts. For some, justice came with peace. For others, questions remain about time, punishment, and the human capacity for both harm and forgiveness. In 1994, a 16-year-old girl was brutally murdered in San Antonio, Texas. Her killer, Humberto Garcia, a Mexican national, would find himself at the center of a global legal and diplomatic storm. As the clock ticked toward his execution, presidents, international courts, and human rights activists stepped in. But the needle still dropped. This is the case that tested justice, sovereignty, and the meaning of international law.
These were Humberto Leal's last words.
He said, "I am sorry for everything that I have done. I've hurt a lot of people. For years, I have never thought that I deserved any type of forgiveness."
The Supreme Court has just announced that justice will not stop Texas from executing Mexican citizen Humberto Leal.
A Mexican man has just been executed for the 1994 rape and murder of a San Antonio teenager.
In 1994, 16-year-old Adria Sauceda was abducted after a party in San Antonio. Evidence would later show she had been raped and savagely beaten. Her body was discovered dumped in a remote field. The man responsible was 21-year-old Humberto Leal Garcia, Jr., who had lived in the U.S. since he was a toddler but never became a citizen. He confessed. The crime shocked the city, a case so brutal it left even seasoned investigators shaken, and it would ultimately sentence Leal to death.
This is the San Antonio killing field where Audria Terry lost her life in 1994, raped and murdered by this man, Humberto Leal, a Mexican national.
For over 16 years, Leal waited on death row. As his execution date neared, his defense team mounted a desperate effort. They claimed he was denied his right to contact the Mexican consulate, a right under the Vienna Convention. The Obama administration, human rights organizations, and even former U.S. diplomats asked Texas to delay the execution, warning of diplomatic fallout and damage to international law obligations.
We believe that Mr. Leal has a strong argument that he was denied consular assistance.
Despite the growing chorus of global appeals, the legal system was resolute. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. Texas Governor Rick Perry declined to stay. The clock was ticking, and the world watched as the final hours of Humberto Leal approached. On July 7, 2011, at 6:21 p.m. Central Time, Humberto Leal Garcia was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. He declined a special last meal and reportedly ate what was served at the prison. His final words were an apology to the victim's family. "I am sorry for everything I have done." Outside the prison, his family prayed. In Mexico, protests erupted. And still, the needle went in.
These were Humberto Leal's last words.
He said, "I am sorry for everything that I have done."
The aftermath was global. Mexican officials condemned the execution, calling it a violation of international law. Activists warned the U.S. had undermined protections that its own citizens abroad might one day need. In the streets of Mexico City, people voiced frustration not only at the outcome, but the diplomatic consequences. For many, the case was no longer just about one man. It was about precedent.
In the streets of Mexico City, where the majority of people are firmly against the death penalty.
Witnesses inside the death chamber described the scene as calm. Leal's final words were clear, emotional, and addressed both the victim's family and his own. As the drugs took effect, he looked toward the viewing window. At 7:21 p.m. Eastern Time, he was pronounced dead. For some, justice had been served. For others, a diplomatic line had been crossed.
Antonio teenager. Humberto Leal Garcia Jr. was pronounced dead at 7:21 Eastern Time.
The execution of Humberto Leal Garcia was more than just a criminal case. It became a flashpoint where justice, law, politics, and diplomacy collided. It raised questions about fairness, international obligations, and the power of states within a federal system. But most of all, it left behind the memory of a young life lost and the global tension that followed one man's final breath. The case of Richard Lee Tabler, a man whose actions not only led to multiple deaths, but also exposed flaws in the prison system.
The state of Texas executed 46-year-old Richard Tabler this evening.
Convicted of a double homicide in Killeen, Texas, Tabler's case took an unexpected turn when he smuggled a phone onto death row, making chilling threats to a state senator. His story is a grim reminder of how crime, punishment, and justice intersect in America's legal system. In 2004, a Thanksgiving weekend turned into a nightmare when Tabler took the lives of a strip club manager and his friend in cold blood. But that was just the beginning. 2 more teenage victims would follow. Over the years, his legal battles and controversial actions would spark debate across the country.
Richard Lee Tabler has been convicted in the murders of Mohammed Amin Ranuni and Haitham Zayed in a Killeen parking lot.
Locked away but still dangerous, Tabler's time on death row was anything but quiet. His crimes didn't stop after his conviction. In 2008, he smuggled a cell phone into prison and made direct threats to a Texas senator, triggering a statewide prison lockdown. This act of defiance was a wake-up call for the Texas prison system. How could a death row inmate gain access to a phone and terrorize lawmakers? His actions led to stricter security measures across the state, but for Tabler, they also ensured that his execution was inevitable. February 2025, Richard Lee Tabler's final day had arrived. His last meal, his last words, and the final moments of a man facing death. Would he show remorse? At 6:38 p.m., Tabler was pronounced dead by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. His final meal was simple, and his last words carried the weight of years of reflection. There is not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions. I had no right to take your loved ones from you. For the families of his victims, justice had been served. Richard Tabler's story is a chilling reminder of the consequences of violence and the complexities of justice. His execution may have closed a chapter, but the debate over capital punishment remains far from over. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.